Y'all can see that, right? Are you getting the view with the notes or just the slide?
Just a slide.
That's good. Okay. I am too. I don't know why it's not giving me notes. It does at school, but I know the slideshow inside and out. So I'd like to ask you, what are the elements of art? We've been through this a lot, so everybody should know them by now.
Line, value, texture, shape, and color.
Yep. What's the proper order of that? Yeah, the first one correct. Line.
Line, the
What do you make with lines?
or shape,
Yep. And what do we put on shapes to create 3D effects?
color.
No, not yet.
Oh, texture,
Not yet.
value.
Yep. And then texture and then color. So again, I just want to keep you thinking in that order: line, shape, value, texture, color, because that's how you can construct things. You make shapes with line, you put value on those shapes to make them look three-dimensional, and then value, texture, and color can work together, and line and shape can work together. But if you deal with things in the order of line, shape, value, texture, color, it's going to give you an organized way to attack any problem. Does that make sense to everybody? So we're going to talk about value today. We've talked about it a little. We're going to talk about it a little bit more and how you can use it in the composition. I have a lot of examples to show you. And then we're going to talk about texture and how that can be used as well. So let me figure out how to get to the next slide here. Thought my arrows would let me. So value occurs in any design just by placing any element on the page. You are creating value. Tonal value refers to the degree of lightness and darkness of an area. Value varies from bright white of a light source to shades of gray to the deepest black shadows, so the whole range of values. How we receive or perceive value of an object depends on the local value of the object. The surface of an object, the color, the texture, the background, and the lighting. Anybody know what local value is? It's okay if you don't. So local value is the actual value of something as we look at it in just a regular light source. It's the actual value of the object. Value is relative to light sources hitting an object, what kind of lighting situation it's in, other values around it. But local value is the actual value of the thing. Does that make sense to everybody? I'll understand that. Yeah. Okay. So we work with value to create volume in a form. You have to consider 7 degrees of light and shadow. Who's that drawing one? Trying to get my grid up here. Bear with me.
I'm in it right now, but
Have you talked about value yet? Probably not yet, right?
that's like where we're at right now. So we're like getting to it.
Okay, so you got to look at the 7 degrees of light and shadow, and I'm going to go through them right now. You'll go over this more in drawing one, but to create volume with a form, you have to consider the 7 degrees of light and shadow. We got direct light, we have a highlight, we have a half tone, which is the middle value on the light side. We have the coarse shadow, which is the darkest part of the shadow, and it's on the leading edge of the dark side as light turns to dark. We have reflected light, which bounces off whatever's in the environment and goes back into the shadows, so it's a little lighter than the core shadow. We have an occlusion shadow, which is a shadow that's created by any two objects coming together. And an occlusion shadow will exist in any lighting situation, whether it be ambient light. If we're in a room that was all lights and we still had two objects come together, we'd still see that shadow between them. And then you have a cast shadow, which is cast by a direct light source being blocked as it hits another surface. So the light can be divided into two groups. You have a light side, which is the direct light, the highlight, and the halftone. And a dark side, which is the core shadow, reflected light, occlusion shadow, and cast shadow. Now, you don't have to know that all this for this class necessarily, but you should be aware of these things when you're trying to draw things that look realistic. I practice drawing spheres quite a bit because I'm always in a quest to create the perfect sphere. So I think it's fun to do. So the direct light, also called center light, is the area of the form faces the light source and receives the most direct light. So when I'm talking about that faces the light source, it faces at a 90-degree angle. So the light source is hitting it directly. The highlight is the lightest area of the form because it's perpendicular to the light source. It is actually a reflection of the light source, so it moves depending on where you are in relationship. This is why your highlight should be the last element that you concern yourself in the drawing. So if you're doing a drawing showing three-dimensional form, whatever it is, it could be a face, it could be a car, whatever, you would deal with like the highlights last in the drawing. The halftone is the gradient between the direct light and the core shadow. And remember, the core shadow is the darkest part of the object, but the halftone lays on the light side of the object. Then the core shadow is a dark band visible where the light and shadow meet. It's the point at which the light can no longer reach the form to illuminate it. And it's the darkest area of the shadow of the sphere in this case, because it's the least affected by reflected light. So there's a thing about core shadows. They're always the darkest part of the shadow. Also, the thinness and thickness of the core shadow on a sphere would depend on a couple of factors. How bright the light source is, how reflective the surface that the object is sitting on is. It'll depend on those two things. If we have a weaker light source and kind of a duller surface, the core shadow will be thicker, but a bit lighter. If we have a really intense light that bounces off the surface and gives us a very thin core shadow, it'll appear darker because value is relative to the values next to it. Then you have reflected light, which again is hitting the surface and bouncing back into the shadow. And here, this is a little blurry, but you can see the core shadow there. Everybody see that little darker part of the shadow? And then you see the reflected light bouncing back into the object. Keep in mind that it exists on the dark side of the object. Then we have an occlusion shadow, and I already explained what that is. And a cast shadow, which is caused by the object blocking the light source. Hi, Jesse, I'm recording this so you can catch the first part of it. So here's a bunch of the same, or the seven aspects of light hitting different objects. And you can see how it affects them in different ways. But even on like this square, you can see the direct light, you can see halftone, you can see core shadow, and you can see reflected light, and you can see occlusion shadow. Everybody see that? You can even have a highlight on the rim of this. You can see highlights, but all these things are lit a little differently, but you'll still see those seven divisions of light. And here's more complex objects, but the things are still happening on these objects. So you have to consider two things when you're dealing with value in a composition. You have to think about value contrast and value pattern. Now, this was a question on the initial assessment, and it'll be a question on the final assessment that's actually graded. So you have to understand the difference between value contrast and value pattern. Value contrast is a relationship between the light values and the dark values of the composition. So that's very important. We're looking at value contrast. You're looking at the differences between the lights and the darks in the composition. Does that make sense to everybody? Value contrast is used to create emphasis on elements within a composition, move the viewer's eye throughout the composition to create depth. This is also true of the value pattern. But here's an example of value contrast for emphasis. What does the artist want you to look at?
The little kid's face that's like glowing.
Yep, and it's because of the contrast. And when I talk about contrast, it's the difference between the darkest dark and the lightest light. So it draws attention. So it's a way to create a focal point. Here's another value contrast for emphasis. What does the artist want you to look at in this case? What do you look at first? Look away and look back.
The girl,
What part of the girl?
her like face and shoulder.
Her face mostly, because if you look, her shoulder has a little bit of gray on it. You see
Oh
that?
yeah.
So he's saving the whitest white and the darkest dark and putting them right next to each other so it attracts attention. The rest of this stuff has gradients and it has grays in it, so there's not as much value contrast. So it draws your eye to the face. Does everybody see that? And like, this is the same thing. We got a Renaissance painting or a post-Renaissance painting, and then we have a comic book, and they're using the same principle. You can also use value contrast to create depth. And there's something you should tell yourself in your head. Contrast comes forward. So when you have high contrast, things are going to pop forward in the picture plane. So when you look at this, why does that building come forward? And why does the bridge itself come forward?
They're both a lot darker than the rest of the painting.
That's half of it. So the darkness of them makes them pop forward. But there's another factor that comes into play. Okay, I want everybody to squint at this, okay? The way we recognize value is to squint at things. So I want you to squint at it. Squint hard, because color will get out of the way if you're squinting and you'll see value. Is everybody squinting? Megan, are you squinting? I see you looking at it. I don't know if you're squinting or not. Okay, so when we're squinting, you see this side of the building and how it appears very black, right? Everybody see that? And you see the underside of the bridge and how it appears very black as well. When it's put up against the light behind it, like this light sky background, it forces it forward in space. Do you all see that happening when we do that? It's contrast coming forward. Now there's a mistake in this painting. What do you think the mistake is? Is there something in the painting that looks like it's coming forward that should be receding?
Is it the water?
It's something on the water.
The boat?
Yeah, so if you look at the boat, and I think the artist did this for to create a focal point and draw attention to it. But if you look at, this is a dark, and it's right next to a light. So the contrast, the value contrast in this is forcing it to come forward. And if I squint at it and think abstractly about just objects rather than what this is a picture of, this is forced forward in the picture plane. You all see that? So you got to be careful when you're using value contrast. And you can use it strategically to make things come forward and backwards. Here's another.
Wait, so I have a question.
Okay,
Should he have like lightened it then?
yeah, so you know what? Should we take it into Photoshop and play with it?
Yeah.
Let's do that. Let me get out. How do I? Oh, I got to stop share. I'm gonna copy this. Bear with me a moment. I gotta get it open in Photoshop.
Yeah, good. You actually, on one of the pictures I was working on a while ago, I made that mistake and you had me go back and fix it.
Right.
Yeah.
I swear I'm not lying about these concepts.
No, you're not.
I'm telling you the truth. So. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So let's take a look at what happens when I play with the contrast. Can everybody see it really well? So I'm going to just pick up some of that. Let's do this. just gonna pick up some of the watercolor and put it over the boat for a second. Okay, so when you look at it, I want you to squint at it now. And then I'm going to uncover this and you'll see the difference. You ready? Everybody ready? See how it pops forward when I do that? See how it recedes when I knock back that contrast? Can you all see that okay? Or is it just me?
Yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
crazy? No.
Yeah, why didn't he do that then?
I think he's just trying to create attention on this. But I don't know for sure because I wasn't there, you know?
Yeah.
But that's another thing you can think of too. When you're looking at design, hold on, I'm bringing the slideshow back. If you're looking at a design, and you see a mistake in it because of the things you learn in 2D design, you might be right because professionals make mistakes. Professionals, sometimes when you're spending a month on a painting, you're too close to it, so you might not recognize some of the problems unless you step back and look at it objectively. So sometimes those things can happen. That make sense? All right, so here's some more value contrast for depth. Now this one's a little hard to recognize because when you see color, it kind of affects what you're looking at with value. So I want everybody to squint at this. If you look at this area right here, and you can look at it without squinting for a moment, this is farther back in space than this and this, because if you look in the deepest part of the shadow, there's something that's approaching black, and here it's a lighter gray. Do you see that? So what we have here is a kind of perspective. Does anybody remember the name of that type of perspective? It's atmospheric perspective. So as we recede into space, we're going to have less value contrast because of atmospheric perspective, because we're actually looking through molecules in the air, water molecules and oxygen molecules and things like that. So things will tend to have less value contrast as we recede into space. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Now there's something interesting in this. He's using value contrast to imply a background rather than drawing the whole background out. So when we see this contour line around the edge of this figure, you see the value contrast between this and this, right? When you do that, it forces this forward in space and kind of implies a background without having to draw a really dark background in around it. Make sense? This is a really detailed picture, but he's still using value contrast. And I want everybody to squint at this. If you look, Batman is darker than the city behind it. He has more value contrast, which is like a dark, dark against a light, light. And because the lines are more spread out in this, as we recede into space, this large black of value next to the lighter white forces it towards us in space. Does that make sense to everybody? Do y'all see that? I want you to squint at it. Hi, Mila. Sorry my email was so late. I'm recording this so you can get the first part whenever you want to watch it.
Okay, sounds good.
So does everybody see that difference there, that value difference? Now, I want you to look at this and imagine this translating into your line assignment. You could do the same thing with your line assignment by having a large proportion of black next to a large proportion of white. It would force it forward in space because of the value contrast. Now this really comes forward because it's almost got a solid black on it next to the lights here and the lights here. So this comes forward too. But we got that little bit of overlap, which creates a little bit of depth for Batman too. Everybody see it? So we understand value contrast. Value contrast is the differences between the lights and darks in the picture. Now, the second thing we got to concentrate on is the value pattern. It's the overall arrangement of the values And you use that arrangement of values to create an ordered composition. So you can use your values as directional forces. You can use them as larger shapes to arrange a nice arrangement on the picture plane. So a value pattern is key to creating a pleasing visual path for the eye to follow as it views a composition. The value pattern is a careful choice of the arrangement of all the values of a piece of an artwork by an artist in order to guide the eye and unify all the objects and figures in the piece. When establishing a value pattern, you have to consider whether a composition is one that is high key, low key, or has a full range of value. So we've talked about this semester. What's a high key composition? Uncomfortable silence. Does anybody know what a high key composition is? Okay, this is one of the beginning slideshows, but this is very important. So a high key composition are ones which are, the value range is dominated by the light. So if you have a value scale of 1 to 10, the majority of them will be towards the light side. If 10's the darkest and 1's the lightest, it'll be, the majority of the piece will be from like 5 to 1 on a value scale. Does that make sense to everybody? Do y'all get that? Okay, so it's lighter composition. It doesn't mean it can't have a black in it, but the majority of the composition is high key. And I showed you this one in the beginning. Everybody remember this one? Now, when we think of a value pattern, or I'm sorry, value contrast, there's a mistake in this picture. Does anybody know what it is? Anybody have a guess?
Is it a
well, oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
The blacks in the background, they don't fade. They're like the same value as the guy's like clothing.
That's correct. So the darkest darks in the background and the darkest darks in his clothing and even the darkest darks in the stalks up front are the same value black. So it's good that you recognize that. What should the trees in the black of the trees in the background look like then?
Probably like a super light gray.
Well, yeah, you're right. Let me go back into Photoshop with this one because I think that's pretty fun. Let me so you can see it, right? So I'm going to take the sky color and I'm just going to paint it over this for a second. So this is the full value range. So this comes forward and it kind of flattens the picture plane out. If I add a little light to it, you see how it pushes it back into space? Now we can keep doing that. And the lighter I make it, the further back it gets pushed. Does everybody see that as it's happening? Here, I got to get that little, those little areas of dark out of the way. So that value contrast is pushing it back into space. And when I do that, it falls way back into space. Do you all see the difference there? You see how it's changing as I move that slider? So like if you wanted to make it look really atmospheric, you could do that. He could even do it on the figure itself. Because we have these dark darks up here. If I did this on the figure, we could move him to the middle ground and then this would pop forward. Do you see how this comes forward when I do that? So we could create a lot of depth by knocking the value contrast back on this and this as well. That makes sense to everybody. I hope you all can see that this is coming forward in the picture plane. You all see that? So
Yeah.
you can play with areas of value contrast to create depth within a composition. But right now we are talking about value pattern. So let me get back to that. Y'all can see it, right? So that's a high key composition. One where the value range is dominated by lights. Then you have a low key composition, which conversely is dominated by the darks. It doesn't mean there can't be a white in the composition, but the majority of the composition is dark. So what's the difference in mood between the two of these? How would you say you feel when you look at a high key composition? Either of these.
I guess it's like happier and brighter, and the low key one is kind of like dark and spooky.
Spooky or dramatic, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's the difference between those two types of composition. You can affect mood in that way. If you have a high key, it can be happy and airy. If you have a low key, it's very dramatic. It's going to create drama. It could be scary as well. Here's another low key composition. This one's a little more mysterious, but the low key adds to that. And then you have a full range of values, which goes across from lights to darks. Now, the thing with the full range of values is that it doesn't have any feeling to me. It's more exposition. It creates less drama. So this is a nice painting. It's very well done. It has a nice gradient going from light to dark. It also has atmospheric perspective in it. But because it's the full range of values, I don't get a lot of emotion from it. You all see that? This feels more dramatic than this. And this feels happier than this. Make sense? So if we think about what low key, high key in a full value range can do, your low key will create drama, your high key will create happiness, light and airy feelings, and a full value range is more for exposition and just telling the story. So good compositions are generally an arrangement of 3 or 4 large masses of value. In order for a picture to have a design, it must have value differences or simply light and dark masses that produce a value pattern. So the value pattern is the arrangement of masses of values. So when you think about that, you have to reduce it to essential forms. Everybody remembers reduction to essential forms on the first assignment, correct? Or on the second assignment, I'm sorry, correct? The abstraction assignment. So you have to think when you're looking for value pattern, you have to think abstractly. So I want you all to squint at this right now. So when we squint at it, you see the dark that surrounds the workers. Everybody see that? And then you see the background that's behind the workers. And those two things work as a very large shape. Do you all see that when you're looking at it? And then you look at the workers together. In overall, and I'm talking about the average value, when we look at all of their values together, I want you to squint at it again. You see them as one large mass. So it's a dark form overlapped by the mass of the caused by the figures laying over the background. So it's a mid-tone over a dark over a light background. Do you all see that? It's 3 large masses of values being put together. So when you're thinking of it abstractly, you could draw 3 large shapes that overlay each other, one with a mid-tone on top, one with a dark in the middle ground that they're all standing against, and then that light background. And then you have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background relationship, and it's all established with value. Do you all see that? This has the same thing. I want you to squint at this. We have the dark mid-tone background. We have a mid-tone back here. And I'm just talking about behind these trees, that area here. So this is a big rectangle. This is a triangle of a mid-tone. Then we have a line of dark that comes through, creating value contrast. And then we have a lighter area up front. So there's 4 masses of value here overall. And I'm talking about average value. I'm not talking about little like highlights within the trees. I'm talking about the larger shapes. So I want everybody to squint at it. So we have a shape like this. We have this coming in. Then we have this shape and this coming in. And they're all value shapes. Do y'all see that? He's created a value pattern to create a foreground, a middle ground, a background, and then a sky. This is a classic landscape setup. You'll have a foreground, a middle ground, and background relationship, and then a sky. And there'll be masses of value. So you have 1, 2, 3 plus sky. That's a classic setup with value pattern for a landscape. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have a question about that? So there's many possibilities when it comes to value contrast and value pattern. And we're going to look at some examples. So again, this is a big triangle of black against a light, but it's interrupted by a lighter light right through the middle of it. So we have that triangle, we have this shape in front of it. You could include this in the shape in front of it. And then you have that background. Large masses of value put together to create an arrangement. Okay, this is one I made, but I want to point out something in this. Value can also be affected by color. So this is a dark shape against a mid-tone with some highlights. But I want you to look at the difference. This is the same value. If you were to look at these in black and white, there'd be no difference. But because I put that red on there, it creates a value difference. You all see that? So you got to be aware that hotter colors are going to create lighter value differences. So if we look at this one, I want you to squint at it. We have a mid-tone of his face interrupted by a dark, so it creates a focal point. And you see the highest amount of contrast is on that mouth compared to anything in the picture. So it becomes the focal point. You all see that? Focal point is often established by value. But we have this dark mid-tone, a light against a mid-tone background. And it can break down into simple shapes. This one's pretty obvious. We got the dark of the cross, and then we have a gradient that's going across the ground, and then a really intense light. And this light being squeezed between this dark gradient and this black is really making it shine. Do y'all see that? It's a really nice arrangement of values. This has a dark mid-tone and a light against a mid-tone background. You see how it really separates itself in space and feels organized? So what I'm trying to get you to do is think of, this is a gradient going from light to dark as we go top to bottom. But what I'm trying to get you to do is think about how you can create large masses to create depth within a composition. This has a dark against a light mid-tone and then a sky value. You all see that? This is another gradient going from light to dark and dark to light. Now you can have compositions with poor value pattern design. And I want you to look at this piece right here. Now there's problems with atmospheric perspective. And this is obviously an amateur painting, so I'm not going to bag on it too much. But because there's no arrangement of values, it should have dark up front, maybe a mid-tone of the lake, and then light as we go back, and it would create a nice distance and space in organization. But because we have darks here, you have darks in the outlines of the mountains, you have darks in the grass in the front, darks on the pine tree, we have a dark in this tree in the middle and dark on this tree. There's no arrangement of values, so we don't, it's a jumbled mess. You all see that? So you got to arrange your values. This one, this is well painted. Wouldn't you say it's a nice painting? But the values could be arranged better so it could create an organized, more organized view. Because right now we have high contrast going from here all the way back into here and into these trees here. And we could establish this as foreground and lighten this area that comes through it up a little bit So this would separate from this, but because they're close to the same value, they don't separate very well. So I would have arranged this as higher contrast, a little less contrast, even a little less back here, and then a sky. And then you'd have that foreground, middle ground, background, and sky relationship. Everybody see that? Now this is concept art. This is professional art. But what does the artist want you to look at here?
Is it that castle in the background?
Yeah, I would agree. Now, what's the mistake in this picture?
I would say that like where your eye is drawn is to the front and not right away to the back, because it's like lighter.
Okay, so for me, it's there's high value contrast on that stuff in the back and high value contrast on the stuff on the right and high value contrast on the stuff on the left. There's also a contrast in colors up here. We have hotter colors. So I do start here and I go back into this, but it's kind of confused on creating the space because of the value distribution in it. You all see that? Now, it's not necessarily bad. This is concept art. I'm sure the artist wants you to look at the castle in the background. So contrast or concept art is supposed to give you mood and not necessarily be as organized because they do it very fast. But there are mistakes in this picture. So splitting the midtone value into light and dark midtones increases the possibilities, but limiting the basic masses to 4 values or less will create a more effective design. So when you think about the larger shapes you're creating out of value, if you limit yourself to 3 or 4, you're going to have a more effective composition. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have any questions about that? Is anybody not getting that? The more you can organize your values within a piece, the better your composition is going to look. So when you carefully consider your value pattern combined with many of the design principles we discussed this semester, your compositions are going to be more organized and successful. And I'm going to show you some with good, effective pattern design. So if you look at this, we got a nice contrast of value up here. Plus, this feels lighter in value to the angel in the midground. You all see that? And I want you to squint at it. You'll see how this separates itself in space from this. Not only because it has high contrast, it's because this feels lighter overall. This is a light against a midtone against a dark. You all see that? So it has 3 large masses of value in it. This has darks and midtones, but if we look at this, this reads a little darker than this middle area. Do you all see that? Which reads a little darker than the city beyond. So we have 1, 2, 3, and then sky. So there's 4 large masses of value here. I personally would have made the middle ground a little bit more contrasty than this, but I still think it's a really good design. This one's interesting. Now, this is by a guy named Anselm Kiefer. And you'd have to see these in person to get the real impact from them because they're gigantic. But if you look at this, and I want everybody to squint at this, and I want you to ignore the dirtiness on the front, okay? I want you to see the big sky shape. I want you to see the ground shape with a little bit of dark running through the middle of it. You all see that? Now that's 2 to 3 large masses, but he's also created a layer of depth by putting this dirt on it. It looks like we're looking through a dirty window. Does everybody see that? So his value pattern includes that dirt on it to create another level of depth, which I think is pretty clever. Now this one's easy. We got a midtone against a dark, against a light midtone, and then sky. But do you see how well arranged that is so it separates itself in space? This is a painting. It's really well done. Now this one's not necessarily about creating depth, but it's about creating large masses of value that help lead us around the picture plane. So we have the focal point. Everybody see the focal point there? And why do I think that's the focal point? Come on, why does that stand out?
Is it because of the black of her eye?
Because the black of the eye, you got a high contrast. So you got that highlight in this against the black. So that's one reason. The other reason is it's a person looking at us. In the rest of this, you're not looking at anything straight on. So this kind of draws your attention in. Plus, we look at people's faces, so we tend to look at eyes first. Make sense? But if you look at this, this is an arrow basically, which draws you up to look at the figure, which leads you over to the eye. So we have a psychic line, we have some good directional forces, plus we're using value to help organize the composition. And I think it's really well done. This is an arrangement of very light or very dark and then midtones. And it's an organized arrangement. This is an arrangement as well. And I want you to squint at this, okay? So when you look at this, do you see the shape that's created by the darks, including the guy? It kind of makes a C and then he penetrates up into the space that is lighter in the background. Does everybody see that? So he's thinking about this big mass and what that shape can do when it's related to the shape in the background. And then we have the bat, that's the focal point. And he's focal point by color placement. There's a little bit higher contrast on the bat and it separates itself in space. But we have a big C shape and then a background that's kind of like that circular shape and then the bat sitting against it. And he's arranging the values so we look at it. So it's beyond just the drawing, it's the value as well. You all see that? And that's in combination with all the other design elements that we've had thus far this semester. So I want to point that out to everybody.
Is this the guy who does the Hellboy art?
Yeah, it's Mike Mignola. That's correct.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Pretty badass, isn't it?
Yeah, it's cool.
You all like this, or anybody hate this? I think it's pretty fun. I mean, it's a watercolor, but it's kind of like comic book at the same time. So this is a really awesome value arrangement as well. It's not only because Batman's diving headfirst down a stairwell, because that's cool in and of itself, but we have this nice shape that's coming together as a big section of value, framing Batman within the composition. So I want you to squint at it. You see that shape here? And then up here, because we're squinting at it, we have a nice interlocking shape that comes in this way. So those two shapes are working really well to tie in together and bring us to Batman. You all see that? Because this kind of hooks into this area right here, and this hooks into this area right here. So they're working together to make us concentrate on the focal point. Do you all see that? It's a really effective value pattern. Plus, this lady's awesome. Now, we've talked about this one as well, but now I want you to squint at it. And he's effectively made a midtone, then put lights up against it, and then put high contrast in the focal point to make you notice it. It's a simple design, but it's a really well-arranged value pattern. This one has a dark. I don't know why I have this one in here. I don't think it's the best arrangement. But I will point out that the focal point stands out really well because of the high contrast against the midtones of the background. Y'all see that? I'm going to remove that one for future slideshows. This one has is again a simple arrangement, but you got a light midtone and a dark against a midtone, and even a sky value. So there's 4 major values there. Y'all see it? This is a high contrast light against super darks against a midtone gradient that gets a little lighter as we go below, but it really separates itself in space. And the contrast right here really pushes him forward. Y'all see that? Are you getting the idea of value pattern? This is a dark midtone, a very light midtone against darks, and it really separates itself in space. Light, dark, and very light, really separating themselves in space by the arrangement of the values. This one's awesome. You remember the Batman picture I just showed you and those interlocking shapes? I want you to squint at this one. Do you see this shape that's created by the darks in the picture? It's almost our conch shell shape. Remember I showed you that conch shell? And it leads you into the focal point. And then the lights in the picture do as well. You'll see those two shapes coming together and then the focal point interrupting that intersection. So he's arranging the values. So he's thinking about value beyond just the drawing itself. He's breaking it down to essential forms when he's doing the design for these things. This has a dark against a midtone and a light, creating depth, even though it's an abstraction. Excuse me. This is a gradient going from light to dark. But you have the dark and then you have the midtone, and then the midtone's interrupted by the focal point in overlaying a light background. This is a dark midtone and then a light midtone in the middle and then dark behind, but it's all interrupted by the red and the high contrast of the light, so we notice it. This is a bad reproduction, but this has a nice, if you look at it, we got this light shape overlapping a dark and then a midtone. Did I show you all this one already? In this class? I know I might have shown it in my color class. But this painting's pretty incredible for for more than one reason. But if you look at it, it's a nice arrangement of values. We got a dark against a midtone with a highlight as the focal point. But I want to point something out about that highlight. If we're thinking high key and low key, I want you to look at this and try to isolate it without looking at anything else. If you need to, get right up against your computer screen and put your finger around it so you can see that color by itself. If you look at that color, the value of that paint is probably on a scale of 1 to 10, it's probably about a 5. It's not a light. It's about a middle tone. But when you juxtapose it against the dark tones of the picture, of this low-key picture, it looks really bright. Does everybody see that? I think that's pretty incredible. But it's something to keep in mind that value is relative to the values you surround it with. Can you all see that? Am I getting too excited about this? Maybe, maybe not. But that is a midtone and it looks like a highlight, which is pretty great. This is just a nice arrangement of values. We got a dark midtone, we got a dark, and then those two shapes are interrupted by the focal point of the picture, which is a lighter value. Plus the high contrast of the strap and the shoulder and the dress next to the hair helps it come forward too. This again is a nice arrangement. We got a light midtone, a dark midtone against a light window. And we also have this, but this is one shape, two shapes, three shapes, four shapes, and it's a nice arrangement of values. Y'all see that? Have I talked about value too much? Let's move on to pattern and texture. Okay, so we talked about line, shape, value. Now we're going to talk about pattern and texture. I'm going to use them together because when we're talking about the elements of art, pattern and texture go together. So we go line, shape, value, texture, color. Line, shape, value, texture, color. So line, and with line we create shapes. We use value to make those shapes look 3D. Then we have pattern that goes on top of those shapes. So when we're dealing in the realm of general to specific, we're going to do line, shape, value first, and then we're going to put texture on it next. Okay. And I'm gonna explain it a little bit. So pattern, for the sake of design, pattern is a repetition of a design with motif. And a motif can basically be anything that's repeated. It fills an empty surface or space. Pattern adds visual interest. So when we're dealing with line, shape, value, and then we start adding texture / pattern, it's there to create visual interest. So when you look at this painting, it's by an artist named Kehinde Wiley. If you saw just these 3 figures and they didn't have the pattern on their shirts or in the background, it wouldn't nearly be as interesting a painting. Also, the focal points wouldn't be as strong. What are the focal points in this picture? What do you look at first? Look away and look back.
Their faces.
Yeah, their faces. So primarily, the primary focal point is the center face. The secondary focal point is the face on the left, because I follow that center face through the fist right next to it to the guy on the left. You could even say the fist is a secondary. And then we look at the guy on the right because we want to see all 3 faces. Now, those stand out not only because of contrast, not only because of the color difference, but because they're calm areas for our eye to look at among all that really intricate pattern. You all see that? So he's using the busyness of the pattern in creating visual interest in the sky and on the shirts and in front. But he's also using that pattern to help calm us down when we look at the faces. You all see it? Yes? No? Maybe? Could everybody turn their cameras on? I only see 2 people, and it's kind of distracting. Thank you. So pattern, our book speaks of horror vacui. Anybody ever hear that, or vacui? It means the fear of open spaces. So pattern can help alleviate that fear of open spaces as well. So this person definitely had horror vacui or vacui. Nice patterning in this picture. Particularly, I really like this pattern behind everything. This relates directly to your final project, but we're not going to talk about that this week. So it's a basic human impulse to have desire to add visual interest to an empty surface or space. When you all see a blank piece of paper, do you feel like doodling on it? It's a natural human emotion, I think. Pattern can be bold. I'd say that floor pattern's pretty bold. Any interior designers in here? What do you think of that?
I wouldn't have picked it myself.
Me either.
Yeah, same.
Very funny. Pattern can be subtle, and I'm talking about the patterning of the stairs. It's very subtle in this picture because of low value contrast, but it helps with the picture. Pattern can be intricate, and this is very intricate patterning. And it can be simple. Now, when you look at this, the pattern has a function. And I'm talking about the pattern that's on the ground plane. So if you look at this picture and it didn't have the pattern on the ground plane, it wouldn't be as nearly as exciting to look at. Try imagining that ground plane without all those little bushes. It would just be blank space. So the patterning is creating visual interest within that empty space. Patterning is a dynamic way to capture visual interest. So if you saw this, you'd start looking at it because of the patterning, and like it would make you look at it further. It can also be used to create order. And when it's reduced to a grid, it is balance and creates unity. So as we look into this, I don't know if it's a mosque or a temple, but if you look at it, each layer as we go back has a different pattern on it. So it really organizes the space from here to here to here to here to here to here. All those different patterns, you step back another level into the picture. Y'all see that? I think it's really interesting. And it's well thought out. It can give equal importance to figure and ground. And when people are doing figure and ground reversals, they'll usually use contrast and create a pattern of dark and a pattern of light, like a checkerboard, and they'll make it reverse back and forth. It can be used to separate figure and ground, and in this case, the bold patterns in the cloth separate you from the background because the patterning in the background is a lot smaller in proportion. This is also creating order with the patterns in this. And it really lets us know what we're supposed to be looking at. So what's the primary focal point in this picture?
Probably that like the top of that little like diamond shape that's around that circle on the top of that
You're right here.
building, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. So what is making you look at that?
Well, first the shape is different from all the other ones on that building, and that like circle, like the background that surrounds it.
Yeah, what Gestalt principle is that?
Figure and foreground.
Figure and
Or
ground, a
figure
little
and-
bit, but there's
figure and
another,
ground.
what's that?
Is it figure and ground or no?
That's a little bit, but there's a stronger one that is really making you notice that.
Containment.
Yeah, it's containment. So there's another thing that makes us notice it. The value patterning, and we got a mid-tone and a dark and a light. So we see this against the light, which makes it stand out because of high value contrast. And then they're all surrounded by this. So they're creating value with pattern as well. Make sense? Here's pattern being used to create depth with this in this image. There's a couple ways it's creating depth within the image. The patterning in the cloth here, we have a dark against a light, which creates contrast. Do y'all see that? And then we have a pattern in the background that gets big to small, which seems to recede into space. And it's pretty effective. Y'all see that as well? All right. Pattern and texture. Now I'm going to differentiate this between the two. They're very similar, and sometimes it's hard to draw a distinction between the two. The essential difference, pattern is visually appealing while texture evokes our sense of touch. So that's the big difference. We're going to have a sense of touch evoked with texture. It can also be visually appealing as well. So texture has a suggestion of a three-dimensional aspect to a surface. It can be achieved through shadows of glossiness or some type of highlight. It can be subtle, but must be present to visually evoke texture. So when you look at this, is this pattern or texture?
Pattern.
That's correct, because it's not evoking, it's creating visual interest, and it's beautiful, but it's not really making you feel like a 3D aspect has been added to the picture. Is this pattern or texture?
Texture.
That's correct. So there's two types of texture. There's actual texture, which is texture that actually exists. It can be touched. And if you're a painter, I guess it would really count for interior design or almost anything. Actual texture, adding it to your composition or your arrangement can add an aspect that people don't normally think about. And I'm sure interior designers think about it a lot, but as a painter, adding texture to a composition can make your composition more interesting because people will want to touch it. Have you ever seen a painting that you wanted to touch? I touched the Van Gogh in Chicago because of the texture on it. Don't tell anybody, okay? But I really enjoyed it. And I don't think Van Gogh would have mind. But when you see a painting that's textural, it often makes you want to touch it. And that keeps the viewer on the painting as well. Does that make sense to everybody? So texture can be a useful tool. Then you can have implied texture, which gives an impression of texture, but exists on a flat, smooth surface. And it still makes people want to engage with the piece, but it's implied rather than being actually there. So here's some actual texture on a sculpture. I think that's pretty obvious. This is by Alberto Giacometti. What do you think that's worth? Anybody? Any guesses?
Probably like
million.
$1 million.
I'm saying 2 million.
I'd say 50. Crazy, right? I wouldn't pay $50 million for it, but Giacometti's worth a lot of money. This is actual texture too. And this is an awesome painting. It's about 30 feet across. So it's really imposing when you see it. But all that texture is rich. It's got lead on it. It's got tar on it. It's got branches. It's got string. It's got broken ceramics. They're really imposing when you see these pictures. This is actual texture too. Interior designers, what do you think of this? I could not live in this room. I think it's terrifying. This is implied texture, and this what's that?
That one right there looks kind of cool.
I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
That one right there looks kind of cool.
You like that room?
Yeah.
I think it's overwhelming, but to each their own.
It gives me like pimp vibes.
It does have that kind of vibe to it. I don't mind the wall though. I kind of like that texture on the wall. I just couldn't live with this and these oranges work with the red. I just can't handle it. And then
It's
like
just the couch for me.
it's the colors right around this area. But anyway, we'll move on. Implied texture. So this is showing texture, implying the texture of a Jackson Pollock without showing it. Norman Rockwell is making a joke here, but he's kind of missing the point of abstract expressionism. He was kind of snooty about it. This is implied texture as well, along with pattern. So implied texture is, there's also another name for, well, you can have implied texture using verisimilitude. And what that means is it's truly the same, it's photorealism. So when people are using photorealism, they'll use, I always have trouble saying it, but verisimilitude to imply texture. So on this one, the textures are really being implied with the paint. There's a little bit of actual texture here, but just the brush strokes and everything are implying the texture. So you get, it invokes a sense of touch when you're looking at it. You feel wet, right? Everybody feel wet when they look at this, and you feel cool. So it invokes that sense. This one does too. So how would this one feel? If you were to touch one of those phone booths, how would it feel?
Smooth.
Smooth, yep. And what else?
Cold.
Would it be cold?
I was
don't
gonna
know,
say
the
hot.
picture kind of looks like it'd be like, I don't know, looks kind of like a grayer picture, like it'd be kind of cold.
I could see it being a fall day, but I still think this phone booth would feel warm because of the direct sunlight, but I can see where you're coming from. But smooth is the texture that you feel when you look at this, and this artist is using that. So implied texture using trompe l'oeil. Who's ever heard of trompe l'oeil? You should talk about that in our history. It's a French term meaning to fool the eye. And this person's painting textures and shapes and using value, and it creates a really 3D look. Who's ever been to Chicago Art Institute? There's a bunch of these in the Art Institute. This was a big thing in the 1700s to have a painting that looks like it's real hanging in your house. This is trompe l'oeil as well. Have you all seen these videos on YouTube where they do the drawing that's super realistic and then they cut the top off of it? Then they show it from a different angle and your mind's blown. It's pretty impressive. So what's the difference between pattern and texture?
Pattern is for visual appeal, but texture makes you like want to interact with the piece. You think you can feel something.
Yeah, and it has visual appeal. So that's correct though. Good call. So we've been through a lot today. We've been through value, we've been through texture, and we've been through pattern. Okay, are there any questions about it? Okay, so as far as value pattern goes and texture goes, you have 1 week if you want to add that to any of your designs for your line assignment. So you can do that. Now I want to go through the next assignment. We're not going to really start it till next week, but I want you to start thinking about what you're going to do. This assignment is not worth as much as the rest. It's being done in Photoshop, so it's a pretty low stakes assignment. But we're going to be doing a Photoshop project. Who's never worked with Photoshop before? Don't be intimidated. I'm just going to show you a few basic tools and you'll be able to do it. Plus, we're going to be in the lab, so I can help you do anything you want to achieve in just a couple minutes. Okay. So your objective is to find interesting elements from 3 or more internet or other digital images and manipulate those elements into a complex and interesting design using value pattern, space relationships, and other design principles, including pattern and texture that we've covered this semester. You're going to learn basic Adobe Photoshop tools, and you're going to create 2-dimensional designs. You're going to explore various gradations of value to create rhythm and space. And we'll talk about rhythm a little as you're working on your projects. You're going to use the devices to show depth, such as overlap, perspective, and you're going to use value to create complex spatial relationships. So the materials you're going to use, you're going to use Adobe Photoshop to generate ideas. You're going to need to find at least 3 images found through an internet search, your own photos, or your own photos. And the images should have interesting elements that you must use to create a composition. I want you to choose large images only, and I'll go over that in a minute. After playing with the various possibilities in Adobe Photoshop, you're going to complete the assignment using the elements that you've selected. Your design has to contain these things. It has to contain a focal point, a value pattern. You have to have repetition with a variation of size to create unity. You have to have rotated elements as well. You're going to integrate positive and negative spaces to create a more complex design. And you're going to use dominance and subordination, which means larger and smaller, to create things of more importance. The design is going to be 8 by 8 and presented on a 1/2-inch border all the way around. If you have not completed your design in class, you'll be expected to use the lab outside of class time. I say a final print image will be presented on and mounted on a 99 board for a critique. So you're going to have to print it out and mount it on a board. And it's got to be printed out on pretty good paper. And we'll talk about that when we're in the lab. You can get things printed at like Meyer or something like that to get a good print of this. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, here I have student examples, and there's a bunch of them on this. These are the only examples I'm going to be able to give you. Remember, it's got to be a square. These are outside the confines of the assignment, but they are creating compositions. So I just want you to look through these and get an idea of what you want to do. And basically, I want you to think of shapes that you find interesting, and I want you to bring those into a composition. It's basically a collage. Who's done collage in here or seen collage? It's basically what we're going to be doing. And we're going to be doing it with Photoshop. Now, all I want you to do for the rest of the day, and that'll be put up on Blackboard so you can read through it, is I want you to kind of locate some images through an internet search and keep track of where those images are. And you can download them to a folder if you want. And I'm going to make a shared folder on the Google Drive. And I'll do that right now, and I'll talk you through it as I'm going to do it, so you can see where I put it. Can you all see this? So the shared drive, we're going to make a folder in the 2D design folder called Assignment 5 Student Folder. Now in that folder, I want you to make a folder for yourself, and you can start putting images you want to take things from in your folder. Okay, that'll be a way to get it from your internet search to the computer lab when we're working in there. Any questions about that? Do you all know how to download photos off the internet? Does anybody not know how to download a folder off the internet? I don't want to assume anybody does or everybody does. Okay, so I do want to show you one thing when you're doing it, when you're looking through Google. Give me something to look up. Anybody give me an interesting shape to look up?
Batman.
Batman. You can certainly use Batman. I approve. So if we look up Batman, you'd go to your images. And once you go to images, this is something you got to keep in mind. This is going to be resolution-based imagery. So we're going to have to look for larger images. And the way you find larger images through a Google search is to go to images, and there's a tools option. And under tools, we're going to go to size and look for things that are large. And then these will all be larger images of Batman. And if I go to one of them, you'll click it and a preview will appear here. This is not the large size that you want. You want to go to the actual page and get that photo. And when I bring that to my desktop by dragging it or right clicking and saving my image, it'll be a larger resolution because we want things that are fairly large resolution to deal with. So what I'd like you to do today is pull some imagery that you would like and put it in the folder that you make for yourself on the Google Drive. Any questions about that?
Well, I just
Um,
want-
oh,
my bad.
Yeah.
You go for it.
Do we have to like search under like, like usage rights? Are we gonna worry about that for
No.
this project?
This is for educational purposes. You can't sell it. Like if you're gonna, you can't make a print and sell it is the big thing. Okay. But
Okay.
we can use this stuff for educational purposes. And plus collage changes the nature of whatever original image you're using. So it could technically fall under fair usage anyway. So you could probably sell it, but I wouldn't take the risk. This is just an exercise to play with value and pattern. What other questions?
I was just gonna say, if you type in like HD behind it, like high definition, it gives you like better pictures when you're looking for one.
That's a good tip. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anybody else?
My question was just like, how many images do we want to have in one picture?
Well,
Like, is there a limit?
you don't want it to be a huge mess.
Yeah,
You need at least 3. I would probably
okay,
limit it to like 5 because you can repeat one element over and over or cuts. Like if you're doing a car, you could cut little pieces out of the car. It doesn't have to be like you could get all you need from really one image if you were doing a car or something like that. Does that make sense? But you
Yeah.
have to use at least 3.
okay.
Any other questions? Okay, so the only other thing I want you to worry about today is making sure your line work's done for the next class. We're going to be in the computer lab for 2 weeks, 2 sessions for each half of the class. And you should be able to finish your composition in that time. Cool?
So then, for the Thursday class, then will you be done with like quarantine? So we'll have in-person class on Thursday?
This
Or
week,
will it be a Zoom critique? Yeah.
I'm not done until with quarantine until Friday, so it won't be till next week.
Oh wait, I thought you said that the Thursday class critique was still this Thursday though.
No. It's going to be due to the
Oh,
following.
so it's next. Oh, the following week Thursday.
Yeah.
Oh, for the line assignment, you're saying it is.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Sorry, I'm not allowed in the building.
No, you're good. I thought you were saying when I asked you that it was this Thursday still, that we were having classes Thursday.
Oh, my mistake. No, we're not.
Okay, so we're having still Zoom class this Thursday though, right? Or not Zoom class anymore. Just this is the only class for the week.
That is, this is the only class for the Tuesday group. If you came to this one, you don't have to, the information is going to be repeated on Thursday.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep, I just want
Thank
you, I want you to pull your images and work on your lines.
Okay.
Anybody got anything else? Okay, I'm going to stop recording.